A rogue judge has unleashed a litany against Donald Trump and the Justice Department for arguing that the case of seditious conspiracy against the Oath Keepers should be dismissed. But as he gave a lengthy rant about why the case should not be dismissed and about the Justice Department's attempt to revise history about January 6th, he nonetheless went through and he dismissed the charges against the Oath Keepers. Before we get into this story, please like, share, and comment at the Becker Brief. We appreciate your support for common sense journalism. Now, activist judges don't even try to hide the fact that they are extremely political and they are using the courtroom as a forum for their personal opinions about the political climate right now. And so January 6th has emerged as a litmus test of people's views about the nature of the right and the left, about extremism in the United States. And so the January 6th has become a proxy battle for the left, arguing that it is not the radical socialist extremists who are a threat to the country, but alleged right-wing extremers like the Oath Keepers. And so Stewart Rhodes, who was not at the Capitol during the siege of the Electoral College and the riot that broke out at the vicinity, including violent riots, and of course all of that should be condemned. He was one of the defendants who was let off the hook because of Donald Trump's pardons and commutations executive order. And we've heard a lot of caterwauling and moaning about that. The bottom line in all of this is that even Biden's Justice Department admitted that the actions taken against the January 6th defendants on the whole was excessive, and there were abuses made in the process of detainment and imprisonment. And so Donald Trump seized on this issue and he held it up as a reason for pardons and commutations. Of course, this may be perceived as self-serving to those who oppose Donald Trump. TDS is a hell of a drug, to put it one way. But the Democrats weaponized January 6th and tried to hold him accountable for inciting a so-called insurrection. This is a narrative that was laid months before. You may check out the Shadow Cabal article in Time, for example, that discussed the wargaming ahead of the 2020 election certification and how they plan to frame Donald Trump as inciting an insurrection, or as they put it, a protest in that article. So it seems this thing has been weaponized from the very start. Even before the January 6 riots took place, there was a narrative battle going on, and we saw the wargaming extensively, not just on the left, but among union members and certain company leaders. They worked together to ensure that there was a coordinated effort to not only frame Donald Trump, but to deplatform and to deprive him of his communications to the public, including calling for peace, which he did early in the afternoon on January 6th, which I always found unusual as the pretext to deplatform him from Twitter, for example. So thankfully that has been taken over by Elon Musk, and it has changed quite considerably since then. And you can speak the truth honestly and openly on platforms, and I'm grateful to those platforms that allow you to lay out the facts and to make an argument or a counter argument against the prevailing narrative. So the judge has been obviously frustrated. His name is Judge Amit Mehta. He's an Obama-appointed judge. Very frustrated with the way the narrative has been eroded and questioned and criticized in the media, and he was obviously miffed about the Justice Department using the pardons and commutations executive order as a justification to dismiss the charges against the Oath Keepers. And let me read a little bit from his order, as you can read on Red State. He said, "The government thus asks to absolve these defendants of crimes against the United States itself. In this court's view, that is not in the public interest. The president could have pardoned them too, but elected not to," Mehta observed. He is noting that they were just given commutations, and I will proceed. Or he could have directed the dismissal of their cases on appeal, but he did not do that either. The government nowhere explains what has changed. So Meta also took issue with the DOJ's contention that the dismissal was needed to protect the defendants from prosecutorial harassment. That is a strange argument, Meta wrote. He said the government was, quote, bestowing upon them unearned grace by wiping their records clean, unquote. And then he proceeded to say that the government does not maintain that dismissal is in the public interest to rectify a fundamental error or a grave injustice. The court does strongly disagree, but that alone is not a valid basis to deny the motion. The court must give way to the primacy of the executive branch in making charging decisions. And then Meta concluded that is the last of the prosecutions seeking to hold accountable those responsible for the events of January 6th. That book is now closed, unquote, Meta wrote. And then he said one more thing about this. Today's epilogue diminishes the gravity of that day, denigrates the work of the prosecutors and law enforcement officers who secured these convictions, and excuses criminal acts that cause a centuries-long pillar of our democracy, the peaceful transfer of presidential power, to buckle. The court cannot write a different ending, unquote. Now, this is tantamount to a first-year political science student's rants about a historical event that happened in history. He doesn't note anywhere here that the rioters, were they actually a threat to stop the peaceful transfer of power? I would argue they were not. They were not armed. This was a riot. They were not charged with homicide, any of the defendants. And so how were they going to stop the peaceful transfer of power simply by having a riot outside the Capitol? In fact, we saw all of the videos about Capitol police officers holding open doors and letting in certain protesters who peacefully toured the building and then left. And that's on video. You can see all of this. There were certainly violent rioters as well, and they should be held accountable for their illegal and dangerous actions. But as people know, if you look at the timeline, what wasn't stopped during these electoral college proceedings was the election certification. What was stopped was the election objections, and that was the legal process for President Donald Trump to remain in power. It had nothing to do with the riot. That was never going to stop the transfer of power in the United States of America. We have the strongest military in the world. The Congress members, they acted like they were in danger. There was not a lot of evidence that they were that close to danger. AOC's testimony about hiding in a closet, in a nearby building, notwithstanding. So this was a bunch of theater, and the theater kids are trying to make this into the worst thing ever. The problem for them is the context. We saw months and months of BLM riots where people were actually killed, dozens of them, and sadly there was about $2 billion in damage, much of it to black neighborhoods. And I didn't see a lot of concern about their lives and about their neighborhoods and all of the damage done to that. So it's not saying that these things are good. Obviously, both of them can be condemned at the same time. That is fine. But to make this out as if it should be punished worse than any of the BLM rioters, for example, that were engaged in those violent riots, well, I don't agree with that. I don't think that that is what justice is in the United States. It should not be based on political narratives. It should be based on the law. And when the judge comes out and makes a political speech like this in his court ruling, it just makes us further suspect that radical activists are twisting the law to fit their worldview, and people are being caught up in unjust rulings and sentencing, and that is something that this executive order was meant to rectify. So in my view, unless these BLM rioters were punished to a serious extent of the law, I'm not talking about anecdotal cases, I'm talking about the bulk of the serious offenders, then I think the J6 defendants should be held to a similar standard. Again, we're talking about rioters. If someone assaulted a police officer, that should be prosecuted very seriously. I'm not talking about those cases. I'm talking about people who were there and simply in a riot, who did not enter the Capitol building or who did not commit any violent acts in the Capitol building, even more specifically. I think it's a sad thing that we have this sort of political polarization in our country. But the thing that will hold us together is an equal standard of justice, the rule of law. And we have to be able to trust people in black robes to be the adults in the room and not to be like woke activists in the courts. So weigh in with your own thoughts about this story. We always appreciate hearing from you at the Becker Brief.